So it gives me great pleasure today to welcome you and introduce Professor Gerard Quinn, who's our first speaker and who's one of the founder members of Project Lifecourse, as indeed is Eamon O'Shea. And Gerard sits on the scientific board of the EU Fundamental Rights Agency in Vienna. He's a former Vice President of the European Committee on Social Rights, which is a Council of Europe treaty body, and he served 2 terms on the Irish Human Rights Commission. He's a Professor of Law here in the university, where he directs the Centre on Disability Law and Policy, and he's a graduate of the Harvard Law School. He led a delegation during the drafting of the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities and directs several research projects in Europe on the Convention. He directs a pan-EU PhD network focused on the implementation of the Convention, and he sits on several advisory boards such as SORAS, OSI, Human Rights Initiative, and co-chairs the Human Rights Watch Board on Disability and Human Rights in New York. He is a member of the Council of State of Ireland, a former Director of Research at the Government Law Reform Commission, and a former civil servant in the European Commission. And the title of Gerard's presentation today is The Right to Live in the Community, the Battle over EU Structural Funds. So I'm glad at this stage to welcome Gerard and thank him for presenting. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Pat. I didn't realise I was the first in the series, but it's a privilege nonetheless. I want to tell you basically a story about a very interesting political battle over the last 2 years, which we were kind of intimately involved in. And the picture I have here in the backdrop, of course, reminds us of the problematic throughout Europe, which is institutionalization and dramatic over-institutionalization of several categories of people. This is genuinely a life course issue. Lumos, for example, in London, reckon there's 8 million children around the world institutionalized, about 2 million of whom are children with disabilities, but the rest are not. It's what the Soviets used to call social orphancy, because we don't have supports for the families. Into the orphanages they go. Likewise, with respect to people with disabilities, it's estimated 1.3 million at the moment are languishing in institutions across Europe, when there actually is objectively no need for it. And there is widespread growth of institutionalization for older people, when arguably if better kinds of social interventions were in place, that would be obviated. So a lot of people reflect on this through the lens of maybe a negative agenda, which is deinstitutionalization. We much prefer to view it through the lens of a positive philosophy of community living for all throughout the life course, and not just for people with disabilities. And I suppose the sad part of the story is that you, some of you at least, are taxpayers. Your tax euros have been spent to build these institutions, particularly in Eastern Europe, over the last few years. And that's really something that's a shame and something we've got to turn back. So I want to talk to you a little bit about the structural funds, where they're coming from, what they're intended to do, the battle we had over the current regulations, and now fresh possibilities, actually amazing possibilities into the future. So I have a picture there of Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel connecting UN moral principles, as it were. Oh, it actually changed by touching the screen. I didn't realize that. Let me go back one. With the European Union itself. You don't normally associate the European Union with principle. You associate it with power, particularly the power to integrate the market. But what's happening, and it's a very interesting process to happen over the last 20 years, is the slow accretion of kind of moral principle to the European Union, which colours how it affects its economic powers and maybe adds new powers to them. So it's part of that bigger story. It's part of the story of the constitutionalization of the European Union, if you will, and maybe the conscientization of the European Union. Now, I joke that 4 or 5 years ago I came across a book on the EU structural funds, and I remember saying to myself, what madman would write a book on the EU structural funds, because it's so arcane and mostly deadly boring stuff, right? But then I got involved in it about 2 years ago, and the Office of the High Commission of Human Rights asked me to write a report on the impact of the structural funds and how they ought to be changed into the future, and here it is. And one of our researchers helped me out in this, Suzanne Doyle, who isn't here at the moment. So amazing to think that's actually 2 years ago, and the rest is history. want to just set it up by talking a little bit about what the structural funds are, how they were set up, how they're governed, and the principles that control them. The amount of monies involved is enormous. Pat was saying earlier on, Horizon 2020 is 80 billion. The European Social Fund is 375 billion. I want to talk a little bit about, take a step sideways and talk about something that's been welling up for children, people with disabilities and older people for a long time, which is what we call a right to community living, what people in ageing call ageing in place. Regardless of what you call it, it's about retaining those social networks that enable you to flourish in your own community. And it's really important to see that tide growing and becoming almost irresistible, whereby the structural funds couldn't but be altered in the current round of negotiations. And thirdly, I like to call it linking morality with power. The actual fight over the last 2 years, how the battle was joined, and how eventually the structural funds were turned around. We hope, and we'll come to that momentarily. Then I'll just spell out for you what the new regulations are, pointing out the possibilities across the life course and not just for people with disabilities. They're the pillars of my talk, those 4 things. So first of all, where are the structural funds coming from and what are they? They actually date back to the 1970s. And in a sense, it was a way of trying to offset some of the disparities in regional development throughout the European Union. Interestingly, not between nation state and nation state, but between regions and regions, because you might find that some regions of England, for example, are entitled to qualify for the structural funds, but not the rest of the UK. There are a number of different funds, and I just want to focus on 2 of them, but there are many, many more. And the 2 I want to focus on is the European Regional Development Fund, which is really focusing on bricks and mortar, the built environment, and how that can be configured differently. And I guess one of the big priorities at the moment in that is how do we switch away from a carbon-based economy and a carbon-based transport network and so forth. Yet it's also important when it comes to our social infrastructure, what kind of social infrastructure we should have and where European taxpayers' money should be put to use. European Social Fund is really all about, I suppose, dislocations in terms of the human impact of the economy, the crises that emerge from time to time, the industries that go bust, the training requirements that are required into the future, and so on and so forth. Regrettably, a lot of this is reduced into regulations. For example, the core regulation that covers the funds into the future is 160 pages long, and it's even hard for lawyers to read, believe me. They all have a clear treaty base. That's very important, because it's not as if these are sums that are expended and then at a whim they're withdrawn. They're permanently part of the sinews of the European Union. Now, of course, the monies put in may expand or reduce, but nevertheless the programs remain more or less permanent. There is a general regulation. I don't know if you know the difference between a regulation and a directive, but a regulation is probably the most important piece of EU lawmaking possible. And there's a general regulation covering what you might call the general conditions that pertain across all of the funds, all of the other instruments. So then there are minor regulations that are instrument specific. So the European Regional Development Fund will have its own regulation, the European Social Fund will have its own regulation, but all subject to the grand chapeau of the general regulation. And that's very, very important, as we'll see in a moment. How do they work? There's a number of principles, and they're actually embedded in the treaties. One is additionality, really, really, really important. We, the European taxpayers, should not be paying for stuff that you, the Irish taxpayers, should be paying for. We will add additional funding to it. Now, very hard to winnow the wheat from the chaff there, but nevertheless, that's the sentiment. And if there's a hint that Ireland is stealthily withdrawing funding from something in the hope of getting European funding, that's it. The game is up. You're out. You're ineligible. The other principles are complementarity, that whatever the European Union does fits with what your objectives are. And the last one is proportionality in terms of interventions. There is an 8-year programming period, and the programming period for the last few years just ended January of this year. So we've just started a new 8-year funding period. And usually the funds are dispersed every 2 years. There's a national call, the Dublin government or the English government will put out a call, people will respond to the call, and so forth. The difference now in the new structural funds is that it's not just Irish priorities, ignorant of European priorities. Oops, sorry, I'll go back there. That is not a very helpful thing. So your national priorities must fit with the overall European Union priorities. And let me leapfrog ahead, okay, because I think it's very important to understand this. The general European Union strategy for the moment on our economy and our society is quite stark. It says our economic model has failed and our social model has failed. So what they want to fund into the future through the structural funds is innovation, innovation, innovation. They're looking for risks. They're looking for completely new ways of framing issues and new approaches. And that's completely different to the past. To the past, it was a very static funding regime and a funding structure. What they're also insisting on into the future is more deeply embedded local partnerships. Now that used to be like cozy relationships with the trade unions and the employers and regional development this and regional development that. The interesting thing now is they insist that in those partnerships be civil society voices, whether it's older people, people with disabilities, or children, and so forth. There is European level monitoring of this, but I come back to that because I heard some chatter that this has been somewhat diluted over the last few weeks. Maybe Delia would have more up-to-date information on that. So there is a kind of a moral imperative to try and turn these funding instruments around to make them serve more moralistic concerns like community living and so forth. And you might say a lot of that is out there in the ether, in the United Nations, or the United Vacations, as somebody calls them. And these treaties have a tenuous relationship with EU treaty law and with EU instruments on the ground, like the structural funds. It turns out that the one that has the most direct nexus to the structural funds is the UN Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities. Oh, darn, I hate that. For the simple reason that it's the only international human rights treaty that the European Union, qua the European Union, has ratified. They have not ratified the Convention on the Rights of the Child, and as yet there is no Convention on the Rights of Older People, although that is a work in process in the open-ended working group in the UN at the moment. Even though, of course, they haven't ratified the Convention on the Rights of the Child, it's still relevant to how the Commission prioritizes certain issues. So this is kind of surplusage which may or may not move the European Union in a particular direction. Actually, just because they've ratified the UN CRPDs, no guarantee at all that the instruments will be turned around and made sensitive to those issues. What you really have to look at is the treaties of the European Union, which are rather stark. Bloody hell, I'd have to stay away from this. Which are rather minimalistic, let's say, when it comes to some of the issues we're interested in. There is an EU Charter of Fundamental Rights. That's part of the trend of constitutionalising the European Union. But here's the kicker. This charter, although it's drafted in grandiose terms, does not, by any stretch of the imagination, impact on the existing competencies of the European Union. So in other words, the competencies started with are the competencies you end up with. Just because you have a grandiose Charter of Fundamental Rights doesn't make a whit of a difference in terms of the depth or the spread of those competences to act. So pretty slender pickings, and as I said, the strongest nexus is the nexus between the UN Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities and EU law, simply because the EU has ratified it and not the others. It's ratified loads of commercial treaties, loads of trade treaties, loads of environmental treaties, but this is the only sort of full human rights treaty it has ratified. The 2010 ratification, I'll stay away from the board this time, means the EU is subject to the general obligations to repeal or amend inconsistent laws or policies and adopt new ones. So we had a golden moment when the old funding round was up. There had to be negotiations on a new instrument, and then there was an insistence that the new instrument should at a minimum respect some of the rights and obligations in the convention. This is lawyer talk, I apologise. There was a 2009 decision of the EU to confirm, and it laid out the legal basis to confirm or ratify the Disability Treaty, and it specifically named the competencies that connect to the UN Treaty, one of which spanned the structural funds. So therefore there was no room for doubt or debate between the lawyers about whether the UN Convention touched the structural funds. The only question was how and to what extent and so forth. One member state, Hungary, that's the Hungarian flag there, not the Irish flag, was subject to criticism by the UN Committee on the Rights of People with Disabilities in the way they used the structural funds. They used the structural funds to open new institutions, or if not to open new institutions, to create mini institutions which were still institutions. And you can see a very interesting tussle there. Hungary would be arguing, well, we're only doing that because the structural fund rules are permissive and enable us to do that. So therefore it's the EU that's primarily responsible, not Hungary. And the EU could turn around and say, well, actually we don't control how the member states spend their money, which is probably true under the previous funding round. Article 19 of the UN Convention is the core one, and I won't go into it in any great depth. You can read our report from, it's actually 2 years ago now, it's unbelievable, literally 2 years ago. It does three things. It says you have a right to choose with whom to live, where to live, and on what basis. Of course, that gives rise to an interesting conundrum, which the barrack room lawyers of VIEW will be thinking about, which is, what if I choose to live in an institution? Shouldn't you respect my right to live in an institution? Park that for the moment, come back to it later. It also assures to you a right to personalised services. Now, when you read the new regulation for the European Social Fund, this is written all over it, that we're going to innovate toward personalised services for all of our citizens. But actually, it was first expressed in the UN Disability Convention 6 or 7 years ago. And then lastly, it confers a right on an individual to have whatever community services are available. They might be quite minimal, let's say, in Greece. They might be quite extensive in Germany. Whatever is available should be made accessible to people who are now living in the community, who were formerly living in institutions, and so on and so forth. So that's taken like as the Rolls-Royce expression of the right to community living. There is an EU agenda on the rights of the child, a fascinating COM doc, a communication doc from 2011, whereby although the EU as such has not ratified the CRC, of course the member states have, but not the EU as such, nevertheless, they purport to put themselves forward as being exemplars in how EU law and policy will respect the rights of the child. And there's a lot of stuff in there where they referred to the right of the child to the, as it were, company of his or her parents, and where that is impossible to the company of something similar, in other words, avoiding institutionalization, or what the Soviets used to call social orphancy. There is no UN convention yet on the right of older people. It's estimated there's 150 million Europeans over the age of 50. I don't know if that's right, but I read it somewhere. There was a European Year of Active Aging in 2012, and one of the themes of it was aging in place. And there is a Toronto Declaration on the continuities and discontinuities between age and disability, and aging in place and community living was one of the more important aspects of that. If you want to look at a website, which I think is fantastic, is Age Platform Europe, have a number of very interesting policy links on age policy in the European Union, and so on and so forth. So a reasonable degree of connectivity between the three cohorts that concern us, at least today. I mean, there are others as well. The first is children, people with disabilities, and older people. So the regulations were up for renewal, golden opportunity. Meanwhile, since the last funding period, the EU had ratified the UN Convention. It also had set itself up as an exemplar in child policy and in elder policy. Golden opportunity to actually do something positive instead of something negative with the structural funds. By the way, there was lots of reports done by the European Coalition for Community Living, by the European Commission itself, showing how the previous funds had been, and these are my words, okay, misused to actually fund the construction of new institutions or the massive refurbishment of existing institutions, or the creation of mini institutions. There was, halfway through the last funding cycle, a principle of respect for non-discrimination put into the previous regulations, and the Commission did a study of the impact of that and found no impact whatsoever. So bland requirements are just not going to do the heavy lifting. That the penny suddenly dropped on that. There are two innovations that were for sure, regardless of how the funds turned out, the regulations turned out. The first was, instead of allowing member states to go off on a frolic of their own, right, to bind them to some agreed general European strategic priorities. So the first innovation in the new round, in the new negotiations, everybody acknowledged it had to be there, was that the use of the funds had to be tied to the EU 2020 strategy. That's the grand economic and social strategy for the European Union up to 2020. Within that, there are several what's called flagship initiatives, and one is the European Platform Against Poverty, which in sort of open-ended terminology purported to protect the most vulnerable in society, blah, blah, blah. I don't like that kind of language, but nevertheless, there it is. The second innovation, which is very relevant as well for our purposes, was that before you even let them come to the till to get a dime or to get a cent, they must first demonstrate that they had met certain minimum requirements, and that's what's known as ex-ante conditionalities. We can talk later about how you assess them, how you prove them, and how you monitor the implementation of them. But that is radical, that is new. That was never done in the past. In the past, they just slipped in vague generalizations like respect, non-discrimination, which everybody ignored. So then we entered into a drafting phase 2012, basically up to 2014. Just to show you the kind of politics of this, the European Commission came forward with very, very strong drafts, which was like a red rag to a bull, particularly to the Council. And the Council, in a sense, withdrew them, as we'll see, some of the more positive proposals. The general regulation, as proposed by the Commission, set out 11 thematic priorities, which you needn't get into. One of them had to do with poverty, social inclusion, and so forth. And another one had to do with discrimination, which covered lots of different groups, particularly people with disabilities. You'll see how that gets translated in the process of negotiating this. And ex-ante conditionalities were attached, and alongside these ex-ante conditionalities were what the Commission calls criteria fulfillment, what you or I might call indicators of whether or not the actual ex-ante conditionality was fulfilled. This is Russian here, midway down. I won't touch it. For trust but verify. Okay. The Commission also innovated by putting in place a much more robust monitoring process than had been the case in the past. Remember, in the past there were lots of scandals about the misuse of the structural funds in let's say, our southern neighbours, and that's something they wanted to avoid. And also, the Commission inserted into its draft the possibility of suspending payments. Nothing worse, right? Suspending payments for persistent breach of the ex-ante conditionality. So this stuff matters, right? The first relevant ex-ante conditionality occurred under the priority theme of promoting social inclusion and combating poverty, and it was the existence and implementation of a national strategy for poverty reduction. But the important point is that one of the criteria fulfillment includes measures for the shift from residential to community-based care. Now, none of us liked the phrase care, right? It should be community-based services. But note, it doesn't denominate who this applies for. It's open-ended, so it applies for children, people with disabilities, and older people alike. Council explicitly rejected that first time out. And also there was another ex-ante conditionality with several criteria fulfillment, which Council also rejected as being too remote from the actual object and purpose of the structural funds itself. And I actually kind of agree with Council on this one, to be honest. because all of this stuff here, a national implementation mechanism for monitoring the UN Convention, you're obliged to do that anyhow, in terms of your own national obligations under the UN Convention. That became a little bit of a red herring, although it actually crossed over into the final regulations. I don't know how they managed to do that. The European Regional Development Fund, as proposed by the Commission, had a lot of good stuff in it. For example, there's a lot of stuff in on networking, cooperation, exchange of experiences between regions, towns, and economic actors. As far as I can read it, that's been retained. And there is, of course, a research dimension to this, a contribution to actually make sure that that happens. Transition from institutional to community-based services, much better than the previous language. Blast it. Is in there. And lots of other stuff like sustainable urban development, which has to do with accessible cities for all and so forth, is in there as well. There was a kicker, which is that there was no ex-ante conditionality and therefore no assessment by the Commission. So nice stuff, but without that hard edge that the general reg itself had. And the draft put forward by the Commission for the European Social Fund had some really good stuff in there. Support equal opportunities for all, people at risk, with the view to increasing labour market participation and transitioning from institutional to community-based care. There's that word care coming back in again. But again, no ex-ante conditionality and no assessment by the Commission, although that could be changed. So all of this stuff, the ex-ante conditionalities, that language about transition from from institutions to community, wiped out by the Council about a year and a half ago. So the big battle was, how do we get reinstated? And if there are genuine objections like this stuff is nice, it's motherhood and apple pie, but it's too remote from the actual object and purpose of the structural funds, okay, how do we find an alternative way of achieving the same end, okay? So that's what the big battle was over the last 2 years. What happened was, once you get into gridlock between the Council and the Parliament and the Commission, then what happens is trilogue process is opened up, which is behind closed doors, purely political. It just happened to be the case that at the point in time where this was reaching a crescendo, Ireland held the presidency of the Council. So there was some opportunity to get at the players, if you know what I mean. There were 3 trilateral processes or meetings, one in 2012 and 2 in 2013. So the process went purely political. We decided with a whole bunch of people that we would up the ante. And when I say we, I don't mean the disability community. Because if you went at this from one cohort or one silo, forget it. So we decided to bring together a coalition of, for example, LUMOS, Children's Rights in Europe, Age Platform Europe on the rights of older people, and several others, and held a very major international conference here in the university, and followed up with a number of things, including a joint memorandum between all of those groups, pressing to the European Council, as well as a legal memo on the liability of the European Union if it left these ex-ante conditionalities out to the UN system. That's what really gets them scared. Because you see, if you as a functioneer in the Commission knowingly do something that is an explicit violation of the European Union's international legal obligations, apparently you personally are held accountable, and your unit. So it isn't just that there's a shame on the European Commission, people would pay a price. So that kind of matters. That's Kathleen Lynch at our conference there. Come back to the last point. These are all the organisations. The European Foundation Centre, which is the network of philanthropies throughout Europe. They have had a consortium of philanthropies on disability rights, and now Eamon, they're beginning a consortium of philanthropies on the rights of older people as well, which is really, really interesting. Equal Rights Trust in London, obviously the European Disability Forum, and then LUMOS in London, which was founded by J.K. Rowling. Anybody know J.K. Rowling? Then we held the conference here, which was very well attended. We put our memorandum together, talking about the legal implications of a removal of ex-ante conditionalities. which frightened a lot of people. And then we put a shot across their bows. This was an article Suzanne and I wrote for the Equal Rights Review in London. We said the European Union is facing a major test of its sincerity and commitment to the UN Convention. Current and positive proposals from the European Commission designed to bring EU structural funds into alignment with the Convention are under pressure from Council. Failure to take the treaty seriously will needlessly expose the European Union and its member states to international legal liability, and such failure will amount to a wasted opportunity to harness the funds to ease a major process of transition needed to embed the right to community living for all. Somebody once said, because I used to work in the European Commission, there isn't a European Commission, there's 22 different European Commissions, 22 different directorates general, each with their own heartbeat, each with their own logic, each with their own way of thinking. And if you went to the actual units that, as it were, propagate EU policy on the rights of the child, or EU policy on active ageing, or EU policy on disability, they would say exactly the opposite to what Council was saying. They would say, we have a very positive view, we want to bring the structural funds into alignment, but the fundamental contradiction is that when you come to the people dealing with the structural funds, they don't necessarily see those lines at all, okay? They're interested in much more prosaic stuff. So the final status of the regulations, I'm glad to say that the frenzied activity over the last year and a half paid very handsome dividends. In fact, you'll see some of the ideas that went into our memorandum, our joint memorandum, and then our legal memorandum actually end up in the regulations and in some of the guidance notes on the regulations. The Common Provisions Regulation, which is the general one that always covers all of the instruments, it's about 160 pages long. Good luck to you. Actually, it's quite positive. It retains the ex-ante conditionalities. Some face was saved on the Council and a new formula was insisted on. By the way, one of the people who really pushed this in the Parliament was Mairead McGuinness, MEP, much to her credit. In any event, it retains a theme combating poverty and social exclusion, including many other themes. There's an ex-ante conditionality, which is the existence of a national strategy for poverty reduction. Now, question why we should be connecting the issues we're interested in poverty. It's another day's story. And the criteria of fulfillment is depending on the identified needs. That was wording we fought against tooth and nail, but nevertheless it went in, because it seems to give rise to the assumption that this is a question of choice. It's not a question of obligation, whereas we were saying it's really a question of international legal obligation. Includes measures for the shift from institutional to community-based care. There's that damn word care again, which we didn't like, but hey, we know what the sentiment is. So you've enough to go on in there to operationalize the funds to begin assisting states in making this transition. By the way, the principle of additionality always applies. So you're not funding states to do something states themselves should be doing, but you're easing that process of transition and so on. They're also retained a whole series of general ex-ante conditionalities on certain grounds, and age is not included. That's really interesting. It's probably because they weren't at the table. And other things are not included, and they're conspicuous by their absence. But disability was in there, and what's covered is the obligation to ensure that member states, before they receive a dime, have a domestic mechanism for monitoring and evaluating whether the UN Convention has been successfully applied at home. I kind of think that's a waste of space, because Ireland's not a good case because we haven't ratified the convention, but the UK has that obligation anyhow under public international law, so it's a little bit of a waste of opportunity and space, I think. Likewise, in the instrument-specific regulations, the European Social Fund, for example, which was adopted late 2003, these were all adopted January 2003, only about 3-4 months ago, says the ESF should not support any action that contributes to segregation or to social exclusion. And that really is code word for institutionalization. And indeed, the ERDF regulation is even more explicit. social inclusion, the transition from institution to community-based services, much better than community-based care, is actually explicitly in there. And of course, even if they weren't in there, the ex-ante conditionalities and the general regulation is controlling over these minor instruments and so forth. The real breakthrough was European Commission guidance on how these ex-ante conditionalities should be operationalized. I don't know why a question mark is put inside everything there. That's something to do with Apple versus Microsoft. But this is great stuff. And by the way, this applies to children, people with disabilities, and older people alike. So they have to, anybody who wants to draw down from ESF has to draw up an action plan on transition to community-based care, which would include individual care, support, and preparation for each service user, ensure continuity and stability in service, in between shifting from, let's say, tying up funds in an institution to releasing them to enable people to live in the community, improving access to mainstream service, curriculum development, create support for families, blah, blah, blah. Really good stuff. Examples of EDRF measures, European Regional Development Fund, development and adaptation of social health and educational infrastructures for the provision of community-based services, improving the quality and capacity for community-based services, home adaptation, childcare infrastructure, blah, 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 blah. Look at this, really fascinating. Building or even renovating long-stay residential institutions is excluded regardless of their size. So we took the view in our legal memorandum that if Ireland or Finland or Poland or Romania had really subpar institutions, I mean atrocious, for example, condemned by their own Human Rights Commission, that's their responsibility. They allowed that to happen. They should not be dipping into structural funds to remedy that. The most they should be doing is dipping into structural funds to ease the process of transition. So this is really the first time in international law and policy that there's been an explicit proviso, no more money for either building or renovating existing institutions. The starting point should be whether the place provides a setting allowing for the possibility of independent living in the community, independent living, inclusion in the community, and high quality care, which is never likely to happen in an institution or even a mini institution. That's what this is saying. It's clear that the larger the infrastructure, the more likely it is that these criteria will not be fulfilled. And we added more to that argumentation. We said there's another provision in the Disability Treaty, for example, that says governments have a responsibility to conscientise the population at large to the rights and responsibilities of people with disabilities. However, if you're in a mini institution, people at large, all they're going to see is the disability. They will never have an incentive to see the person or relate to the person or move the person out, which is an added argument against even mini institutionalization. So they go very, very close to this kind of argumentation here, which is quite remarkable. So what are the conclusions? Principle and power are coming closer together. They're not exactly perfectly aligned, but they're coming closer together in the regulations for these structural funds. EU additionality can now be created in easing the transition to community living for all across the life course. It does not discriminate. And it's best done across the life course. I'm sure if we went at the process of intervening with the Council and the Commission and the Parliament on the basis of disability alone, forget it. You're just not going to have the impact. But if you can bring in the other cohorts along with you, it's actually a better thing to do, and it's much more impactful thing to do. Sums are very big. 74 billion in the European Social Fund alone. And 23% of that is going to go for the thematic heading of inclusion and eliminating poverty. Do the math. I'm not a business person. You can do the math. That's a lot of money, right? And there is written into the European Social Fund regulation that Horizon 2020 has to be cognizant of the priorities being set in the ESF. So it's possible you're going to see calls being influenced and churned out to actually turn people to thinking about how to do this better. So it's really now up to us to make the most of the funds, as I say. And those words are deliberately chosen because the Soros institution had a fund called Making the Most, which is to try to train up the Roma groups throughout Europe to make the most of their existing structural funds opportunities, which are actually quite large. And something similar now has happened, like a Structural Funds Watch, to make the most of the structural funds across the life course for people with disabilities, children and older people. That's us there in the Parliament, one of the committee rooms, holding a hearing on the structural funds about a year and a half ago. So, thank you very much.
Okay, thanks very much, Gerard. Are there any questions that people would like to ask? Any comments?
How do I get the money?
In relation to the funding and people applying for funding, do they actually explain what they mean by those terms as well? So, like, I often read stuff talking about community living, but the reality of the practice is not at all community living. It's bringing the institutional thinking into community and just running a little mini institution, sometimes in one house.
Yeah.
So do they explain exactly what they mean by the terms that they use?
Well, the European Commission guidance note is about 300 pages long, right? And it goes through each of the thematic headings, and then it breaks it down into the ex-ante conditionalities, and then goes even further into the criterion of fulfillment, the major one of which is transition from institutions into the community. And I was very pleasantly surprised at how in your face it is. I mean, it's rare for a European Union document to say not a dime to build new institutions or to refurbish existing institutions. And they also go very close to saying that 2, 3 is enough, any more is an institution. They don't quite go that far, partly because the UN bodies themselves haven't gone that far yet, but that's the... So I would encourage you to read that guidance note. Thankfully, that's only about 7 pages. The rest of it is about 300 pages. And it's really good stuff. We were pleasantly surprised recently when a house beside us in the countryside was renovated. I said, fantastic to see new blood in the community, right? And then I noticed the wall going higher and higher and higher. It's actually a group home, but it may as well look like a mini prison. But they should not be getting a dime of structural funds into the future. Of course, if the government doesn't rely on structural funds, then none of this is relevant. So if it just spends it out of general expenditure, then it has to answer directly to the UN Committee and not to the EU as such.
Thanks for the question. Any other questions or comments, please? Gerard?
Thanks, Stuart, for that. That was really informative because I suppose for a lot of this discourse that's going on, it's like disconnected from it, so it's good orientation for it. I suppose one of the things I was interested in is when you picked up on the various different thematic areas coming out of Europe 2020, and certainly we'd be very much aware of the various different areas there. They're kind of touted as being societal challenges around exclusion and so on. And the first element was what you picked up on around the use of the language around poverty, and sometimes how that's used interchangeably with language around social exclusion, which of course is
Right, there's no logic to that.
No, there's no logic at all, because the exclusion obviously is much more multidimensional than some of the poverty. And I suppose just looking at your 2020 strategy, without connecting it directly to what you presented on here, and looking at what's come out of Horizon 2020 in the first call, certainly the aim of reducing the number of people excluded by 20 million by 2020 seems to be predominantly invested in the mechanisms of reducing unemployment and building in that sort of sense of innovation into creating labour market participation. Just wondering if you could comment on that in relation to perhaps how the EU might view ideas of social exclusion, even though obviously all this is very positive, but whether or not that actually is still something that's kind of running underneath and how...
Well, there's another thing exerting an undertow on the funds, okay? And it's called the Social Investment Package. Have you been looking through that?
No.
It's really about how all instruments of the European Union, which include the structural funds, will be used toward the agenda of subventing population groups that are at risk because, I don't know, industry is changing, business models are changing, and it kind of draws away some of the funds toward those priorities. The thing to watch is that every 2 years your government, I think it's only Border, Midland region in this country, still qualifies for a modicum of the structural funds. Every 2 years they have to put their program together. They have to do it in partnership, and now they have to do it in partnership with civil society groups as well. So there's ample room to influence the national program, provided it's broadly within the parameters of EU 2020 and the social investment package as well. I don't think that answered your question.
No, but it was a nice response. But I suppose it's just the fact that, when sometimes when you get the sense that the EU are talking about social inclusion and social exclusion, that it still comes down to labour market participation.
Well, look, the European Union is primarily an economic instrument, right?
Yeah.
Indeed, in the olden days, when I used to work in the Commission, we always spoke of social policy as the social dimension to the market, right? So it's investing in social policy in as much as it bears some sort of rational relationship to the enhancing of efficient market forces, right? So it's only really, really slowly that the European Union is understanding that the social sphere rests on an autonomous space, and it's not necessarily to be valued or protected just because it happens to be a precondition to an efficient market. Nevertheless, the hard legal powers in the social sphere in the European Union are pretty non-existent, right? So what you're left with then are these financial instruments that can achieve the same end. But you can't legislate for social policy. For example, there's a rule against exportability of social benefits, even to European Union countries. Now, there are a lot of, modus vivendi worked out, whereby you can export some of your medical care entitlements and so forth. But a lot of the discretion, for example, in Ireland, if you get a personal assistance budget, and it doesn't exist in Finland, and you get an offer of a job in Finland, you can't bring your Irish personal assistance budget with you. That remains, purely national. So the bulk of our social system is funded nationally, not at European level, and it's not regulated by European law or policy.
Yeah. And even within that, Gerard, do you think there's a convergence of is there any sort of convergence towards a uniform, almost philosophical approach?
There is. Yeah.
Do you think? There's questions, I suppose.
Well, one of our problematics is we don't have a European social model. We have several different European social models. And the treaties make explicit space for that to continue if the member states wish it to continue. There's what's called a process, an open method of coordination in the socialist field, whereby certain majestic generalities are set and then governments display good faith efforts in trying to achieve them, but with a lot of latitude as to how they achieve them. And that latitude leaves a lot of space to continue with old models if they wish to continue with old models. So it's, social integration has certainly not happened the way economic integration has happened. And probably won't, to be honest with you.
Okay. Any other? Is there a final comment? Anyone make a question? Is that it? Okay, listen.
You got to be connecting with your government, as the Irish government or whatnot, to find out what their programming priorities are and to see whether you can influence them and then fit within them. And also, particularly if you look at the regulation on the European Social Fund, a lot of stuff in there on research, a lot of stuff in there on sharing best practice, a lot of stuff on there on, for example, supporting networks throughout Europe to try and map innovation, so to speak. So don't just stick to Horizon 20, also look into the very specific instruments here as well. I'll leave it at that.
Gerard, thanks very much. Thanks for giving us a great start to the seminar series. And just a further announcement to make that the next seminar will be given by Pat Dolan, the UNESCO Chair, and UNESCO Chair and Child and Family Research Centre Director. And it's on here on Wednesday, the 30th of April at 1 o'clock. And the theme is intergenerational connections, prospects, possibilities and issues from a youth perspective. So So listen, thanks very much for coming. There's tea and sandwiches over in Friars. We really appreciate you taking your time to come here, and just to thank to the team people working with me on Project Lifecourse for putting this together, and a special thanks to Danielle Cannon, who's on maternity leave, who did a lot of work on this as well. Thanks very much, Gerard, for giving us a great start.